Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This presentation is about the communist takeover of America, and you can probably see or sense it today, and I can prove that it's still underway at this very moment. Essentially, communism will be the form of government when we are ushered into our one-world utopia that these ancient secret societies have always had in mind for us. To understand communism, we must start with its inception. And as usual, we find a secret society behind it all. In this case, the Society of the Jesuits. And this is interesting because they are still participating in this operation that began almost 200 years ago. And I will show you all of the players. As we begin this dive, I must remind you all that the Jesuits are the ones of whom have perfected, if not invented, Hegelian dialectic. That is, create a problem, get a mass reaction due to that problem, and lo and behold, come to the rescue with a solution. All of which the problem, reaction, and solution were known and pre-planned before even presenting the problem to the masses. They also are masters of pitting two opposing sides against each other, while covertly controlling both sides. This is how they create whichever Hegelian dialectic situation that they need at the time, like the U.S. Revolutionary War, the American Civil War, and even Vietnam. Because, ladies and gentlemen, Ho Chi Minh, his most famous namesake, but he had at least 6 different names throughout his life. He was a mystery school agent himself, but this is a whole other presentation on its own. So, let's look at the Jesuits and how they secretly had their hand in this new ideology. From jamesjpn.net. To understand the Hegelian character of Jesuitical deception, we must consider that the doctrines of communism were designed by the Jesuits through what were known as their reductions in Paraguay in the 17th and 18th century, which were a series of communes in which Jesuit priests exercised authority over the natives there. In that environment, the Jesuit order maintained control over a group of South American Guarani Indians, who they educated and trained to work on their behalf, generating goods that were later sold in the markets of Europe. What does this have to do with communism? Well, from a 1933 book entitled The Revolutionary Movement by John Finlater, we read the following. The Jesuits had established 20 strong mission centers called reductions, with many thousands of the Guaranis enrolled as their members. The Jesuits aimed to set up there a complete communistic system, in the sense that no individual rights were recognized and there was no private property. Everything belonged to the state and was supposed to be shared in common. But in reality, much of the greater part of the proceeds of goods sold was always remitted to the Camarilla, the Jesuit superiors, in Europe. And the Guaranis got only the bare necessities of life in return for their toil and sweat. Did the Jesuits design the original blueprint for a commune economy or communism? The short answer is yes. The Jesuit leaders provided the necessary food, clothing, and health care the Indians needed, while using them as, quote, worker bees to generate income for the order. Just as the Soviet Union would do in the 20th century, the Jesuits maintained strict control over the activities of their subjects. They perfected their system of totalitarian control, all the while telling the world that their oppression over other people was, in fact, utopia, a deluded fantasy maintained by some Catholic historians to this day. Sound familiar, folks? The ideas the Jesuits developed in Paraguay over a period of 158 years were then communicated to Karl Marx in the 19th century. Again, now from another excerpt from the book, The Revolutionary Movement. Quote, for 5 years, Karl Marx went to the Jesuit school in Trier, which, during the Prussian period, was known as the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium. End quote. Along with Karl Marx, Other leading communists like Joseph Stalin and Fidel Castro were also trained by the Jesuits. In fact, the former Jesuit general Pedro Arrupe once boasted, quote, "And what makes you think we are not proud of Fidel Castro?" And we will get more into Marx and Stalin momentarily. But before we get into Marx, there's one last connection to make. Most of you listening to this understand that the Vatican is not what we think it is and has been infiltrated by the secret societies, most notably the Jesuits. But the Vatican's support for communism seems to have been somewhat suppressed. While it is true that the popes are known for condemning communism, this on their part seems to be more political manipulation than anything else, since Rome has repeatedly supported the principles of communist thought. The Communist Manifesto was first published in 1848, and within less than 50 years we find the Vatican publishing declarations in agreement with it. In his book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania, author John W. Robbins notes the following, quote, "One of the Roman Church state's most influential statements on economic matters is the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum on the condition of the working class. In this encyclical, or writing, the Roman Church state allied herself with the proletariat, which in Marxism is the great and final enemy of the capitalistic order." The encyclical's Marxism is so blatant that one Roman Catholic writer declared that, quote, "much of the encyclical, or the Rerum Novarum, appeared only to repeat in more orthodox language what Marx had said 10 years before. Indeed, there are paragraphs, if not pages, in the Communist Manifesto that might have been written by the Pope." Then, incredibly, after about 100 years of various papal diatribes against communism in all its forms, the Sunday Times of London reported that, quote, "Karl Marx, who famously described religion as the opium of the people, has joined Galileo, Charles Darwin, and Oscar Wilde," all mystery school initiates, dear listeners, has joined Galileo, Darwin, and Wilde on the growing list of historical figures to have undergone an unlikely reprisal by the Catholic Church. Karl Heinrich Marx was born on May 5, 1818 in Prussia to a wealthy and connected family. He was Jewish and came from a long line of rabbis for the Trier Prussia area, dating back to 1723. He was a mystery school agent, most likely the Jesuits. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, these groups are all the same, all on the same team, married together in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt with the founding of the Bavarian Illuminati, all working for the same goal. Anywhere you look, online or otherwise, one can't find a thing on Marx's childhood. In 1847, Marx was invited to London in order to join an organization known as the League of the Just. The League of the Just was an organization created and ran by European radicals, anarchists, and secret society members, and in fact, the League of the Just was itself a secret society. Marx obliged and renamed the group the Communist League and planned to unite it with other German worker committees across Europe. Marx and his associate were commissioned to draw up a manifesto summarizing the doctrines of the League. So he wrote the manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848, known today as the Communist Manifesto. Commissioned by the Communist League and originally published in London just as the revolutions of 1848 began to erupt, the manifesto was later recognized as one of the world's most influential political documents. It presents an analytical approach to the class struggle and the conflicts of capitalism and the capitalistic mode of production, rather than a prediction of communism's potential future forms. The Communist Manifesto surmises Marx's theories concerning the nature of society and politics, namely that, in his own words, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It also briefly features their ideas for how the capitalist society of the time would eventually be replaced by socialism. In the last paragraph of the manifesto, the author calls for a forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions, which served as a call for communist revolutions around the world, hence the 1848 rioting. Aside from the secret society, the League of the Just, commissioning the writing of this document, many researchers have pointed to the Masonic origins of the London Publishing Company that published the document, along with the almost worldwide dissemination of it through many secret society-controlled organizations, and the coordinated revolutions kicked off that same year of its publishing in perfect unison as proof of the secret society involvement. In 1864, Marx became involved in the International Working Men's Association, also known as the First International, to whose general council he was elected at its inception in 1864. And ladies and gentlemen, this is simply a rebranding of the Jesuit-controlled secret society League of the Just. Author and researcher Eustace Mullins wrote in his book, The Curse of Canaan, quote, "The Communist International was the first step in this program of activism. At first it was simply known as the League of the Just, a branch of the Illuminati. This group commissioned Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto in 1847. It was published in 1848 and was immediately given worldwide circulation by the international offices of Freemasonry. Throughout his long political career, Marx was known to work actively with both the Jesuits and the Freemasons. In 1864, Marx organized the International Working Men's Party in London. In 1872, he moved it to New York, where it was merged with the Socialist Party. Marx received a regular stipend from American newspapers as a columnist, employment which had been arranged for him by the Freemasons. Another excerpt from Mullins' book says, quote, "Not only did Karl Marx maintain close ties with the Jesuits and Freemasonry throughout his career, he was also directly related to the British aristocracy through his marriage to Jenny von Westphalen, a descendant of the Countess of Belcarus and Argyll, two of the oldest titles in England." And here's another interesting quote from historian and author Louis Marshalco from his book, The World Conquerors. "It is more interesting to learn that Karl Marx was not the real founder of Communist World Revolution. Its true father was Adam Weishaupt, founder of the Freemason Order of the Illuminati. Leon Trotsky, Lenin's right-hand man and ruthless leader of the Red Army, wrote this in his book entitled My Life, The Rise and Fall of a Dictator in 1930. Quote, "It was during that period that I became interested in Freemasonry. In the 18th century, Freemasonry became expressive of a militant policy of enlightenment, as in the case of the Illuminati, who were the forerunners of the revolution. On its left, it culminated in the Carbonari. Freemasons counted among their members both Louis XVI and the Dr. Guillotin, who invented the guillotine. In southern Germany, Freemasonry assumed an openly revolutionary character, whereas at the court of Catherine the Great, it was a masquerade reflecting the aristocratic and bureaucratic hierarchy. I discontinued my work on Freemasonry to take up the study of Marxian economics. The work on Freemasonry acted as a sort of test for these hypotheses. I think this influenced the whole course of my intellectual development." End quote. Dear listeners, now would be the time to briefly give an example of the foundation of Marxism and communism. Its basic natural science is based on Darwinism. They believe in survival of the fittest, that humans are just another animal on earth that must be cattled. They believe that based on this, that conflict is key to human development. Again, survival of the fittest. They believe in evolution, and this is interesting because so do the ancient mystery schools. In fact, evolution is the key concept within the mystery school doctrine. They believe that through knowledge, man can evolve into God. They call it apotheosis. And you can see it in picture form if you ever visit the Capitol and look at the mural on the ceiling. It is a mural showing George Washington transitioning from man to a god, and it's called The Apotheosis of Washington. So Darwinism leads them to identifying as an animal and adopting a survival of the fittest conflict type lifestyle, to the obvious next step of then adopting atheism, no God, no belief in a higher power. And so that is when the authoritarian leader then takes over that position and is seen as the higher power, that God, all by design. As you all can see, communism creates misery. It creates violence, it creates insurgencies, and it creates psychopathic leaders. The most prominent communist leaders of the 20th century were all ruthless mass murderers, ladies and gentlemen. It's almost like communism is a tool for genocide because that's what seems to have occurred in these regimes. From Lenin starving out his own people, estimates claim 7 million killed, to Stalin starving his people, killing political dissidents. KGB reports 42 million dead from this scumbag. To Castro, to Mao, to Ho Chi Minh in Cambodia. In fact, Mao was installed in China in order to initiate a war on the Korean Peninsula, and Ho Chi Minh, the same thing in Cambodia, in order to kick off the Vietnamese conflict. And one brief expansion on Fidel Castro and his Jesuit training, folks. As briefly spoken about earlier, Father Padre Arrupe, the black pope at the time, visited Cuba in the early 1980s. And reporter Munoz Unsain had the opportunity of talking to him on several occasions. In one of them, recalls the reporter, the black pope gave him the classic Jesuit spiel, ending by telling him that he was very pleased with the work of the Jesuits in Latin America, particularly of the many important disciples they have developed who later reached prominent positions in all walks of life. Well, I guess you are not proud of all of them. Don't forget that Fidel Castro was one of your disciples, said the reporter. To which Arrupe answered, in the classic Jesuit way, by using a question to answer another one, says, and what makes you think we are not proud of Fidel Castro? Now, folks, I'm just a guy with a computer. But knowing what I know about Hegelian dialectic and what the inner workings of the Society of Jesuits and how they use problem, reaction, solution, and how they pit two opposing sides against each other in order to then come in and mediate a solution, one in their interest. It seems to me that after World War II, America was either knowingly working with the Jesuit communists or was tricked over and over and over again by them. It seems as though almost everything America did after World War II was in the best interest of the divide and conquer, fear-mongering, never-ending conflict, military-industrial complex crowd, keeping the world in a state of fear, division, confusion. And I find it hard to swallow that America was just a deceived pawn in this almost centuries-long game. Ladies and gentlemen, let's now fast forward to modern times. Here's a partial list of the 45 goals of communism in America, and I'd like you to check these out and remember them. Eliminate prayers and any expression of religion in schools. Infiltrate churches and replace true religion with social religion. Discredit the U.S. Constitution and America's founding fathers. Infiltrate and gain control of the labor union movement. Infiltrate and gain control of teachers' associations. Use schools as transmission belts for socialist indoctrination. Break down traditional cultural standards. Discredit the family as an institution. Infiltrate and gain control of the press, radio, TV, and the entertainment industry. Use the courts to weaken basic American institutions. Promote the UN as the only hope for mankind. Demand that it be set up as a one-world government. And infiltrate and gain control of one or both political parties. Do any of these things sound familiar to any of you out there? Now, with those goals in mind, now think about the undeniable socialist, communist leanings of progressive environmentalists, the labor movement, academia, the mainstream media, the religious left, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and one of the country's major political parties and half of the other one, along with a large segment at least of the opposing political party. Please reconcile now. How is this plan being progressed? In one of his most revealing quotes, Lenin said, "The goal of socialism is communism." The idea that creeping socialism should precede outright communism is an acknowledgement that totalitarian rule is so frightening to people in a free nation that it must be quietly slipped into those societies in bits and pieces. It is through that incremental process that socialism serves as an under-the-radar transitional gateway to the unrelenting oppression of full-blown communism. And dear listeners, this is why the agents of the mystery schools like Albert Pike and Manly Hall outwardly advocate for a one-world socialist government. They know that they cannot call it communist. They cannot call it a communist state until that country has already made its transition, and it is only then that it will be declared its true embodiment, communism, because at that point it will be too late to do anything about it. If done via stealth and deception, free societies can be overthrown from within in a way that goes virtually unnoticed until it's too late. The means through which that sub rosa conversion is accomplished is called cultural Marxism. And just check out what happened when Mao attempted this cultural revolution in China. Known as Obama's ideological mentor, the late Italian communist Antonio Gramsci was one of the 20th century's most influential Marxist thinkers. Disillusioned that the communist movement in Italy failed to incite a Bolshevik-style revolution in his capitalistic country, Gramsci developed a stratagem to quietly overturn capitalism in Western societies from within. That strategy is known as cultural Marxism, the process of gradually infusing communist doctrine into a society via its culture. Gramsci's strategy is reflected in one of his most pertinent quotes. It says, "Socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media." End quote. Are you folks listening? Gramsci theorized that what holds a capitalist society together are the pillars of its culture, the structures and institutions of family, religion, education, politics, law, the arts, and the media, as they provide the social cohesion necessary to a functioning society. Undermine the principles that these cultural institutions embody, and a capitalist society can be overthrown from within without firing a shot. Now, knowing that this man Gramsci is referred to as Obama's ideological mentor, does Gramsci's ideology look anything like the actions and statements of our last president? As Hitler's forces rampaged across Europe during World War II, the world's greatest capitalist nation, America, entered into a, quote, strange alliance with Britain, the greatest colonial power, and the Soviet Union, the greatest communist state. During this time, a peculiar phenomenon occurred across America. A popular wave of emotional fervor for the Soviet Union surged throughout the nation. Influential men, magazines, and newspapers began literally fawning over Joseph Stalin. And let me stop right there. This statement implies that simply based on our alliance of convenience with the USSR, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of an alliance, somehow resulted in America falling in love with the Soviets? Folks, is it possible that our media was controlled to a certain degree even back then? President Roosevelt even went as far to release Communist Party USA leader Earl Browder from prison as a means to promote national unity between American communists and the general public. And let's stop right there for a moment, folks. Earl Browder, U.S. communist leader, he has a grandson of whom you may have heard of. A guy, a fugitive, depending on your point of view, named Bill Browder. Bill Browder hit the scene big time for me in Helsinki in 2018 when his name came out of the mouth of President Putin during his press conference with Donald Trump. Browder is, I suppose you'd say, a businessman as far as his official means of generating income, but when one researches him, you'll find that he's basically a grifter, money launderer, tax cheat scumbag. And oh yeah, he happens to be a communist. And of course, this communist and ally of the leftists / communists in our government was invited to Congress in July of 2017 to testify in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee on the now debunked, but you won't hear that from the MSM, Russian collusion interference into the 2016 election. His testimony was with regards to FARA laws. Ladies and gentlemen, the spider web is humongous. It's all connected. All assets are deployed, folks. We are currently watching a Jesuit communist takeover of America. And I think this operation goes back, way back. In Helsinki, President Putin claimed that Browder had accrued billions through fraudulent means, and then he donated $400 million of that fraudulent cash to the Clinton campaign in 2016. Of course he donated to her. And just to prove to you all that this is indeed all connected, two last tidbits on Bill Browder is that he grew up in Chicago, same place as Hussein and other communist sympathizers like Bill Ayers of the Weather Underground, and he worked for Robert Maxwell's MCC conglomerate. And if you don't know about Robert Maxwell, please watch the video on this channel entitled A Spooky Tale of Ghislaine Maxwell, and you'll see what it is they've been doing and how they've been doing it, and you'll find that it's all the same players, folks. Browder is clearly a communist with a communist agenda, and since the USSR is dissolved and no longer exists, this explains the rift between Browder, still leading communist operations versus Russia, along with other countries, including the U.S., and Putin. Folks, in case you all don't know this, Russia is no longer a communist country. That ended when that wall fell down, if you all remember. The Russian leadership doesn't want nor need Browder tooling around in that country. We mentioned past President Barack Obama and his ideology and his communist mentors a moment ago, but there is another member of his sphere that deserves a look, and that is Valerie Jarrett. Federal Bureau of Investigation files obtained by Judicial Watch reveal that the dad, maternal grandpa, and father-in-law of President Obama's trusted senior advisor, Valerie Jarrett, were hardcore communists under investigation by the U.S. government. Jarrett's dad, pathologist and geneticist Dr. James Bowman, had extensive ties to communist associations and individuals, his lengthy FBI file shows. In 1950, Bowman was in communication with a paid Soviet agent named Alfred Stern, who fled to Prague after getting charged with espionage. Bowman was also a member of the communist sympathizing group called the Association of Interns and Medical Students. After his discharge from the Army Medical Corps in 1955, Bowman moved to Iran to work, the FBI records show. According to Bowman's government file, the Association of Interns and Medical Students is an organization that, quote, has long been a faithful follower of the Communist Party line, end quote, and engages in un-American activities. Bowman was born in Washington, D.C. and had deep ties to Chicago, where he often collaborated with fellow communists. And folks, if you don't know, Chicago is a hotbed for communists and has been since the 50s at least, and especially the 60s. And please go check out the piece done by Sir Patrick Mack at In Pursuit of Truth YouTube channel on the Weatherman. Judicial Watch also obtained documents on Bowman from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, showing that the FBI was brought in to investigate him for his membership in a group that, quote, follows the Communist Party line, end quote. The Jarrett family communist ties also include a business partnership between Jarrett's maternal grandpa, Robert Rochin Taylor, and Stern, the Soviet agent associated with her dad. Jarrett's father-in-law, Vernon Jarrett, was also another big-time Chicago communist. According to separate FBI files obtained by Judicial Watch as part of the probe into Jarrett's family's communist ties. For a period of time, Vernon Jarrett appeared on the FBI's security index and was considered a potential communist saboteur who was to be arrested in the event of a conflict with the USSR. His FBI file reveals that he was assigned to write propaganda for a Communist Party front group in Chicago that would, quote, disseminate the Communist Party line among the middle class. The middle class, ladies and gentlemen. The middle class is being targeted. Do you know why? Because the lower class, or the peasants, usually always fall into the Marxist line, as the Marxist line comes to them as hope or change. Sound familiar? The top of the upper class is all for it, for they are the bourgeoisies. They control the means of production. They will be set for a while. It is the middle class that always needs to have the most time on their radicalization, and it usually doesn't work. And it is this class with whom the Marxists will eventually have to meet in the final clash for said country. They've been softening us up, folks, for this moment for over half a century. Please tell me that you are all making the appropriate connections, dear listeners. Continuing from Judicial Watch, it's been well documented that Valerie Jarrett, a Chicago lawyer and longtime Obama confidant, is a liberal extremist who wielded tremendous power in the White House. Faithful to her roots, she still has connections to many communist and extremist organizations, including the Muslim Brotherhood. Jarrett and her family also had strong ties to Frank Marshall Davis, a big Obama mentor and Communist Party member with an extensive FBI file himself. And folks, this was filings by the FBI, not something someone online put together. This is an FBI intelligence file that was presented to us by Judicial Watch. And if you don't know, Valerie Jarrett's daughter is now a news media personality, and this has been pointed out in a video on this channel entitled The Intelligence Infiltration into Our Media. These are communist agents, folks, working with our CIA and other government groups in order to topple the American capitalist system. John Guandolo, a former FBI special agent and author, recently spoke to Dave Hodges of the Common Sense Show to talk about who is really behind the violent riots we are seeing all across America. Guandolo is a Naval Academy graduate and combat veteran who served in the Marine Corps. He now advises governments on national security matters, particularly the threats posed by the global Islamic movement. And he wrote the book Raising the Jihadi Generation, Understanding the Muslim Brotherhood Movement in America. In the interview, he told Hodges that he believes the U.S. is currently under attack by a partnership that has been formed between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Communist Party. When people see the violence in our streets, he says a lot of them think it's justified. However, the reasons we are being given for the violence are lies, and the perpetrators are not civil rights groups. Instead, they're Antifa and terrorist organizations. In fact, he said, these are not peaceful protests that have been hijacked since the beginning. They were violent communist riots aimed at causing insurrection in America to serve their aims. Now, dear listeners, think back to the beginning of this presentation. There was a reason that we had to go deep into the inception of this ideology. The things that we are watching unfold come directly from the communist insurrection playbook. He called it a violent revolution against the United States, saying, quote, And they have been very clear on their websites that their purpose is to bring down the constitutional republic and replace it with a communist socialist government. That means that activities that serve that purpose are part of a criminal conspiracy to overthrow the government. It's sedition and it's treason. End quote. He said that people think Black Lives Matters is a mildly left-wing group that wants equal rights. That's just not true. It's a hostile, communist, anti-American organization that seeks to overthrow the government. And it needs to be treated like that, and its leaders need to be treated like that. When asked directly if what we are seeing is a marriage between the U.S. communist interests and the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist interests, he said, yes. He also talked about the communist and Marxist connections of the founders of Black Lives Matter. For example, co-founder Opel Tometi can be seen in photos circulating online smiling and hugging Venezuela dictator Nicolas Maduro in 2015. A man who has made no secret of the fact that he wants to cause revolution in the United States. In fact, Breitbart reports that some observers have said the violent riots spread throughout America right now look suspiciously like the violence that erupted across Latin America in 2019. In Chile, leftists burned down churches, destroyed subway stations in Santiago, and terrorized residential areas, all supposedly over a proposed hike in the subway fare and other economic concerns. The protests, like those in the U.S., started out relatively peaceful, but violent elements soon took over and spread destruction. And just like in America, many of the locals reported that the most violent acts were carried out by foreign actors, with many of those arrested in Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador tied to the communist and socialist regimes of Cuba and Venezuela. Guandolo also mentioned that Antifa has been going overseas to get support, with some members meeting with Al-Qaeda and ISIS operatives in Germany to discuss obtaining weapons such as chemical weapons and bombs. Investigative journalists who have infiltrated Antifa report that they seem incredibly well organized and funded, and their tactics indicate they are being advised by highly experienced professionals. Yes, dear listeners, it seems as though the Muslim Brotherhood has teamed up with the Jesuits and communists, and I believe that it is because they must. They could not defeat the American system using just one faction. They needed to ally, and let's be honest, these Islamic theocracies are really no different than a communist state, so this all works out well for all parties involved. And if we can all agree that there has in fact been a marriage between these ideologies, then we can look at another powerful politician's handler named Huma Abedin. The New York Post ran a detailed investigative piece over a weekend about Miss Abedin's work at the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs from 1995 through 2008, a Sharia law journal whose editor-in-chief was Abedin's own mother. This is not some accidental association. Miss Abedin was, for many years, listed as an associate editor of the London-based publication and wrote for the journal while working as an intern in the Clinton White House in the mid-1990s. Her mother, Salaha Abedin, sits on the presidency staff council of the International Islamic Council for Dawah and Relief, a group that is chaired by the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Her father, Saeed Zainul Abedin, was a professor in Saudi Arabia who founded the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs, an institution established by the government of Saudi Arabia with the support of the Muslim World League. The Muslim World League was, quote, perhaps the most significant Muslim Brotherhood organization in the world, end quote, according to former federal prosecutor Andrew C. McCarthy. Its then General Secretary Umar Nassif founded the Rabita Trust, which is formally designated as a foreign terrorist organization under American law due to its support of Al-Qaeda, he wrote. Who here remembers Joseph McCarthy? That name, unfortunately, has been synonymous with witch hunt or hysteria. Two very interestingly suspicious words. See, Joe McCarthy was supposedly exposing communists and communist sympathizers within the U.S. government in the 1950s, just a handful of years before the assassination of John F. Kennedy. When the truth seekers of those days began to unwrap the deception perpetrated upon the world, the mystery school-controlled CIA came up with an ingenious plan. That plan was to discredit the valid information being brought to light about the Kennedy assassination by calling the information a, quote, conspiracy theory, and the peddler of such information a, quote, conspiracy theorist. These two concepts did not yet exist during the, quote unquote, McCarthy witch hunts. And I suspect that it's this McCarthy hunt on communist infiltrators that got the CIA thinking of ways to discredit truthful operations like the McCarthy crackdown. They at this time used quote unquote hysteria and quote unquote witch hunt. And they later perfected this line of attacking the truth a few years later after the JFK assassination, using the now common derogatory phrase of conspiracy theory. Dear listeners, I'm afraid that old Joe McCarthy was spot on, and he was eventually attacked to the point of paralysis through the communist Jesuits, agents in media, government, and culture. Now, many of you are well aware of John Brennan and his communist leanings. In fact, he voted for the Communist Party in 1976. He was subsequently hired by the CIA 4 years later and then stationed in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia as the station chief. John has been one of the most vocal anti-Trump, pro-Russian collusion narrative, pro-establishment voice in the U.S., and one of the most vicious, too. It is John and his CIA that kicked this whole Spygate campaign off in an attempt to overthrow the sitting government. Many of you don't know, however, that James Comey was also a communist. From a May 17th, 2019 airing of the Rush Limbaugh Show, Rush says, how many of you have thought, if you've thought about it, how many of you have heard or thought that James Comey was a lifelong Republican? I have. I've always thought of James Comey as a lifelong Republican. I've been told that James Comey is a lifelong Republican. It turns out not to be true. Are you aware that James Comey used to be a communist? In a 2003 interview with New York Magazine, James Comey said before voting for Jimmy Carter 1980, he'd been a communist. He admitted, quote, I'd moved from communist to whatever I am now, end quote. Now, we know that John Brennan, Obama's CIA director, was a communist, or at least he voted for the Communist Party. But I had never heard this about Comey. Zero Hedge has the story. I think the Red State has the story too. Now we find out that under Obama, the CIA director and the FBI director both had histories of not just flirtation, but serious immersion into the communism. And like the KBG always says, no one ever leaves the KGB. Nobody ever leaves this way of thinking. Here's the New York Magazine article. And there's that quote with the full context. It says that Comey has been savaged by Republicans, yet lauded by Chuck Schumer. Just what kind of Republican is he anyway? This sets Comey howling again. Quote, I must be doing something right, he says. In college, I was left of center, and through a gradual process, I found myself more comfortable with a lot of the ideas and approaches the Republicans were using. He voted for Carter in 1980, but in 1984, quote, I voted for Reagan. I'd moved from communist to whatever I am now. I'm not even sure how to characterize myself politically. Maybe at some point, I'll have to figure it out, end quote. No, Jim, you aren't to be trusted. We will be the ones that figure it out, scumbag. Back to the Rush Limbaugh Show. A caller calls in from North Carolina and says this. I have two quick comments. You mentioned earlier that James Comey has said that he supported the Communist Party in the 70s. Is that correct? Rush responds, he voted. He voted for communist candidates, yes. The caller then says, quote, so we know that Brennan supported the Communist Party and now Comey, yet they both later on were employed by the FBI and CIA. Went up through the ranks, became the directors. I think that Comey, Brennan, and Clapper, it wasn't just pride about them wanting to have their daily intelligence briefings with Trump. They wanted to be able to pull the puppet strings and control the information. The caller continues. It's amazing to me that those two, after it was known, it had to be known, that they supported the Communist Party, were even employed by the CIA and the FBI to start with. I just don't see how that happened. Rush replies, my guess is that the people doing the vetting wouldn't see that much wrong with it. And I believe that Rush couldn't be more correct with that statement. Dear listeners, we are currently in the final stages of an operation that may have begun a century ago, but in the least began about 75 years ago. We are witnessing a Marxist communist takeover of the United States of America. They have, over time, decades, infiltrated our government, our culture, our religion, our policy think tanks, our schools, our medical institutions, our media, and ladies and gentlemen, this seems like a Herculean task, but the reality of the situation is this. I want you to first look at this as a war, as a Marxist attack upon our country by very high-ranking, powerful Jesuits. And when an entity is at war, they must have an army of soldiers. And when an entity is as meticulous and disciplined and organized as the Jesuits are, then one doesn't need a million-man army and billions of dollars worth of weapons in order to launch a head-on attack against American forces. No. The Jesuits instead will kill an important general, for instance, not using an expensive bunker buster, but a plant, whose oils are secreted into the drinking glass of a powerful figure. Assassination. Quick and efficient. In fact, over the course of the 250 years since America's founding, these people have had centuries to study the American system, to determine which positions in government hold the most influence, which positions need to be secured in order to implement a certain aspect of a plan, like to control the ranking members of the Senate Intel Committee, or the Senate Appropriations Committee, or the head of the CIA or FBI. A really good example of this is to implement and control a pandemic by simply controlling the head of the National Institute of Infectious Diseases, like the position held by the Jesuit Dr. Anthony Fauci, along with a few specific influential government officials, and you've got yourself a plandemic, which has immediately stripped many rights away from its citizens due to fear propagation. In fact, with 200 years of researching our system, I contend that it only takes a few hundred, quote-unquote, soldiers placed into particularly influential positions in order to control a country and to ultimately impose a Marxist revolution upon said country. When we understand that America has many checks and balances protecting it, we can then make the leap in saying that it may only take 1,000 or two, quote-unquote, soldiers placed into the right positions worldwide in order to control the entire world. And it is exactly this that I am saying has occurred. Imagine this now. Conventional warfare. Over the millennia's pit humongous armies against each other, killing thousands while only advancing their cause in small increments at a time, and then repeat. When one army defeats the other, the winner imposes its will upon the remaining citizens, and since it was imposed, it intends to not hold up as long. But when one partakes in a silent war, one conducted through infiltration, like here in America, through propaganda, lies, and brainwashing, the infiltrators get the population to vote for the Marxist ideology because the insurgency created by those in key positions makes the population believe that the current system doesn't work. The invading army can gain more ground, and this ground can be held on to longer because of this fact. And being 2020, and having such advanced tech, like cameras, robots, and drones, ladies and gentlemen, if the Marxists are successful in this takeover, it will be a Marxist revolution that will be maintained until the end of time. The communist Jesuits are in control of all of the necessary tech needed to impose a strict police state, one that Trotsky and Stalin would be jealous of. And with the ability to spy on anyone or anything at any time, if there are no constitutional privacy rights, and with the ability to put a drone in each neighborhood in America, this Marxist system that they will impose will be lasting. Imagine if today's tech would have been around during the Cold War when many were attempting to escape East Germany. Imagine how spying techniques would have been used to crush all dissidents before they could even attempt to cross that bloody line. As we are watching the useful idiots riot each night, tear down American statues, defund police, and declare their hate for America, I ask you all to please keep this video in mind and understand the tactics that these devils have used in the past. You will find that what you are witnessing right now all comes directly from the communist playbook. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Joe McCarthy was an American hero, and his work at that time was maybe the most important problem facing America, as we can so clearly see today. The defamation of his work and the things he was doing may be the most important piece of work ever performed by the Jesuit communists, because it allowed them to fester and grow and become what we are watching unfold today. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like, share, and subscribe. And please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching.